Great. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we start our presentation, we are going to have some opening remarks from Mike Maroli, who is the Town of Mendon Select Board Chair. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, everybody. I'm coming to you remotely from CCRI in Rhode Island. I'm about to teach a class of my own here for the next 4 days for a group of police officers and state troopers from Massachusetts and Rhode Island. But I know that believe it or not, our town administrator actually has jury duty today. So I was asked to fill in, but I'm excited to introduce Ann and the rest of the group to you. As you saw where you walked in, you saw that terrific campus construction that's being done. And, the real goal for this workshop was to share what Mendon learned about using green stormwater infrastructure so that other towns can do projects and will adopt these practices. So just to give a little bit of background, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, MVP, was created in 2017 to make Massachusetts more resilient to climate change. And it's interesting to me about how much buzz has been created by that project, and particularly that porous pavement and some of the other technological advances that's being incorporated into that beautiful campus project that you saw when you walked in. The first year that we started this, we received almost $170,000 to fund the first year of a 2-year project for the town hall campus area. And then, we used town funds from different sources for the second year. And, with the grant writing funding, a group called the Horsley Wittens Group designed the project working with a town committee. And those are, Dan Beyer, who's obviously there. And, one of the hats he wears is the Parks and the Recreation Director. Obviously, the Horsley Witten Group, specifically Rich Clater, who's a professional engineer, and he's also the lead AP president. Gemma Kite, who's another professional engineer, she's a senior environmental engineer, and Eliza Hoffman, who's a design engineer. Our chief Bill Kessler, Hillary King, who's the regional MVP representative, our Mendon Police Chief, Dave Kersey, as well as Ann Mazar, who's our Community Preservation and Land Use Committee Chair. She really spearheaded a lot of this over time. Kimberly Newman, who's our town administrator, she is actually departing at the end of June to take a new position, doing the same thing for the town of Orleans down on the Cape. So she may have her hands full with climate change down there on Cape Cod, but we wish her well. And then Kathy Schofield rounded out this committee from the Historic Commission. Some of the other people that we worked with, Alan Tatro, who again just recently retired, but he's the highway surveyor. Jack Hunter, who's been a key to all of this. He's the town planner. CMRPC helped us secure his services. Obviously, our Board of Health, the whole Historic Commission, the Planning Board, and the Planning Board's engineer, and the Water Commission, along with multiple select boards over the years that made this come to fruition. So I just want to welcome you all. And I really want to recognize all the members of the committee, Ann and Dan and the rest, for all of their work. And I hope you found this informational, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Appreciate you being with us.
All right. Take care.
Excellent. So I think we have a small enough group that I'd like to go around and just do some introductions, just so we can all know each other. We'll be spending the next couple of hours together. Maybe we can just do name, organization, and what your role is. And Hillary, I'm going to start with you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Hillary King. I work for the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. I'm the Central Regional Coordinator. So I've worked with Ann and this team to design the project.
My name is Jill Mitchell. I'm Senior
Town Planner Jack Hunter presenting the Oxford schedule.
I'm Elena Brugos. I'm on Mendon Select Board.
I'm Joyce Gilmore, I'm on the Board of Health and Environmental Engineering.
I am Ronnie Carson. I'm on the Highway Department.
I'm Andrew Goyette, I'm on the Highway Department.
Peter Chauvin, Mendon Highway Department foreman.
Me, Rika Alexander, agent and natural resource protection manager for Franklin. It's long. I just manage all those things. It's really bugs.
I'm Chloe Vaughn. I'm from the Northbridge Conservation Commission. I also am on the Upton Board of Health for septic inspection, and I work doing productive landscape design.
Jay Carlson, I'm on the Planning Board.
Kimberly Chair McLean, Town of Hopkinton Conservation Administrator. Hannah Rogers, Town of Hopkinton Environmental and Special Services Coordinator.
Hello, everybody, Jeff Barnes, Hopkins Conservation Commission. It's Carson, City of Westchester.
Mike Goddard, Select Board. Select Board.
Bob Sweet, Conservation Commission.
Susan Cahalan, co-chair of Conservation Commission. I'm also environmental consultant and instructor at Harvard Center School of Sustainability.
Leah Bada, I'm a resident here in town. I'm going to throw my hat in there for the Concom and be at the BC. I'm also a sustainable grower at Farm to Table Crops. This is right up my alley.
Good morning, all. My name is Todd Picker. I'm with the Board of Health.
And I'm Ellen Agra, town clerk for town.
Dan Byer, the Director of Parks and Recreation.
Hi, Eliza Hoffman. I'm working with Ellen here on the design of this project for Heritage Project.
I'm Mike Easler. I'm a landscape architect with Horsley Witten, and I did not get to work on this the entire project, but I wish I did.
And I'm Rich Glader, I'm a principal with Horsley Witten. I was principal in charge and worked pretty closely with Eliza and Gemma on the design work.
And Ann Mays, our Land Use Committee and Community Preservation Committee.
Great, and I'm Gemma Kite. I'm a senior environmental engineer with Horsley Witt Group. We are the contractor that helped the town go through this project. And really this workshop is the culmination of about, correct me if I'm wrong, 4 or 5 years of the town working together to plan, design, and now construct this project. And what the town really wanted to do with this workshop was showcase how they materialize some improvements, some new developments in their regulations and their bylaws to encourage GSI, great stormwater infrastructure and low impact development, and use it to have a practical demonstration right here at the town hall. And so over the next couple of hours, the first hour we'll be in here, we'll go through a bit of a project background, we'll talk about what is GSI, give you an overview. Next steps for your community. If this is inspiring to you and you want to do something similar or want to start the ball rolling in your community, what are those next steps? And we'll start a primer on GSI maintenance here. That's usually the biggest topic. It's where we get a lot of questions on the maintenance of these GSI practices. But just before you guys reach the death by PowerPoint moment, we'll get you out of your seats, we'll get outside, we'll take a campus tour, and we'll get into more of the weeds of maintaining GSI. No pun intended there. So, Anne, I'm going to turn it over to you to start us off.
Oh, do you want to give me that clicker thing, or
Yes.
okay?
Can everybody see the screen?
Okay. And can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, everybody can hear me? Yeah. So I'm going to start a little bit before we became an MVP community, just to give you some background. In 2016, Mendon got a technical assistance grant, and this was through the Audubon, Mass Audubon. And what they did was they went through all our bylaws, and they sort of graded them as to how environmentally friendly each of the bylaws were, sort of like good, bad, great. And then they gave suggestions on how, like, if you want to make your bylaw better, this is what you could do. If you want to make it excellent, this is what you could do. And so then we worked with the planning board and the Conservation Commission and sort of figured out, you know, what made sense. And we ended up with a really great document. But unfortunately, it wasn't used because no one had the time to really integrate it into the bylaws. So then in 2018, we became an MVP community. And we submitted a grant to take all those suggestions and actually put them in the bylaws and the subdivision regulations. And we worked with CMRPC, our Regional Planning Commission, and the Planning Board and Conservation, and we made changes that we thought were realistic and would pass at town meeting. I guess I do this. Okay, so those are some of the changes we made in the bylaws, and they passed in 2020. But also, you know, we felt like people weren't using them enough. Change is difficult, and people like to do things the way they've always done it. And so we thought that maybe a demonstration project would help. So this is what this campus originally looked like. And in 2020, around that time, we built a new police station, and we adaptively reused the old fire station, and it was a great project and looked wonderful. But the rest of it was just asphalt and parking. And it was mostly, it was very hot in the summertime, had heat island effect. It did not drain well. You know, chemicals collected from the road, washed down into the parking lot, and the town well is like right under the parking lot, which is not so great. We're going to move it to the edge, but you know, you want clean water, and in Mendon and probably your towns too, I mean, clean water is really important for wells and drinking water. So, anyways, we figured that this would be a good area to show low impact development techniques. It was dug up anyways, and we wanted to do something, but we definitely needed experts. We did not know how to design a site like that. So we applied twice to MVP to get a grant, and we actually got funding from SNEP. It's the Southeast New England program, and they gave us money so that we could pay Horsley Witten to do the technical aspects of the grant, and that was super helpful. So second time we got the grant to design the site, and then the town paid for the construction. And an aspect of this project had to be, it had to be educational. So there will be signs, and people can do a self-tour to learn about GSI and low impact development. And there's a website, if you haven't visited it, that has a lot of explanations on the site. All right, so this coming up is the rendering that Horsley Witten Group put together. And we don't have pictures of the final site because obviously you've seen it's a work in progress. It's not complete. The grass isn't in, the brick sidewalks aren't in, and the signage isn't up yet. So we, invite you to come back when it's done so you can check it out and see what it looks like. But what we wanted was greenery, shade, pervious surfaces, but still maintain the number of parking lots that we had, have it be low maintenance, want stormwater to stay on the site and naturally filter and clean. And as Mike Maroli mentioned, we had a team that worked on it, and we met every 2 weeks, once a week sometimes, and the collaboration was really great. The fire chief would tell us if his equipment could get in and turn around, if the angles were right. The police chief, made sure the traffic flow worked for having the police station here. Kathy from Historic Commission made sure that we were sensitive to the historical aspects of this site. So it was a real team effort. And then Hillary, do you want to say a little bit about MVP? Let's see.
Answering.
Yeah, it won't go. There we go. Sure.
So the MVP program was, it started back in 2016 with Governor Baker, Governor Baker's administration put together this plan to help our municipalities consider the impacts of climate change. We're seeing hotter days, we're seeing longer, more intense periods of rain, and funding was put in place to, one, help start the conversation with our planning grants, and two, provide action grants so that the discussions that municipalities had and the actions that they came up with could be funded through further grants. So at this point, we have about $20 million each fiscal year to provide for action grant funding. Our RFR comes out every spring. And so right now, the RFR is closed, and we're currently looking at projects that will be funding for FY24 coming up. Also new this year is our MVP, we're calling it 2.0 process. Since a lot of the planning has happened about 5 years ago or so, this updated process will allow municipalities to bring together their core team again and to kind of revisit who, gets to speak and whose ideas come to the table, and revisit the resilience priorities they made 5 years ago. And then there will be funding dedicated, about $50,000, to develop and implement a seed project that comes out of this new process. So that's pretty exciting. We have our pilot. We're selecting about 30 municipalities this spring, and they'll start, I think, over the summer. So if your MVP plan is around 5 years old, in 2017, 2018, 2019, this will be coming up, and each municipality will be able to do it to update their plan and still be eligible for action grant funding.
All right, thank you.
It's not fancy, so I'll go
Okay.
through.
So I love these pictures. What I wanted to kind of express in this is that, this was a gathering place. And, when it's all asphalt, it's just not welcoming, and you don't want to, stay in the place. And it's also historic. The town hall was built in 1840, the library, or old library, in 1896. And on the left, it's 1950, and kids are in line to get their bicycles inspected at the old fire station. And then on the right, people, it's like 10 or 15 years ago, just waiting for the Memorial Day parade to go by. Yeah. So, okay, so project inspiration: preserve and complement the history of the site, more green space, improve traffic and pedestrian flow, provide space for people to connect with each other and nature, provide tangible example of the zoning bylaw changes. And the project focus: sustainable solutions, green stormwater infrastructure, low impact development, and a demonstration site.
Excellent. Thanks, Ann, for that. And just wanted to mention that this is super informal. So if folks have questions, feel free to interrupt us. Let us know. Also, feel free to come up and get more refreshments as you need to. Again, super informal here. So I'm going to talk about what is GSI, give an overview of it, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Eliza, who's going to talk us through what GSI practices we used here at the Mendon Town Hall. So let's start from the beginning. What is stormwater? I'm sure most of you know what this is, but as a recap, it's precipitation flowing over the ground and not soaking into it. In more natural areas, including our forests and our wetlands, stormwater can soak into the ground. That's what it's supposed to do. In urban areas and more developed areas where we've got a lot of impervious surfaces, things like streets, driveways, sidewalks, building roofs, stormwater can't penetrate through these hard surfaces. So instead, it flows over our roads, it flows over our driveways, it picks up things like sediment, bacteria, pollutants, and sometimes it gets put into infrastructure, and then it gets discharged at another point, usually into our waters, into a stream, into our river, into our oceans. So impervious surfaces, as this diagram might be a little hard to see, but not only does it increase the amount of runoff that is coming off, but it also increases the speed at which that stormwater flows. So urbanization affects the way that water moves through our landscape. The more a watershed is developed, the more impervious surface we add to it, the more we are changing the way the watershed can manage the stormwater. And the result of this is things like increased pollutants to our waterways, an increase in the severity and the frequency of flooding events, increase in our erosion of our waterways and sometimes even our infrastructure on the roads, the displacement and destruction of habitat for fish and aquatic species. And less infiltration into the ground means that we have a decreased amount of base flow for our streams. It also means less water is going into our aquifers that we use for drinking water sources. So when you look at those, you might think, oh, these are all kind of like not connected, they're seemingly isolated. But when you look at this on a watershed level scale, it can really cause and create havoc, and it can create impairments in our waters. So Mendon is situated in the Blackstone River watershed. I'm sure most of you know that. Neighboring communities are also in this watershed. There is a tiny bit of Mendon that's in the Charles River Watershed Association, so I don't want to ignore that. But the majority of Mendon is in this Blackstone River watershed. And in the draft Massachusetts 303D list, which lists our impaired waters as assessed by the state of Massachusetts, it has listed segments of Blackstone River as impaired for a variety of pollutants, including some of the headwaters streams to the Blackstone River. So this is a real issue for Mendon and for the neighboring communities. Stormwater is a tangible impact to our waters. We can manage it. We can manage it better at its source to help improve the water quality of our waters. So how do we manage it? Traditionally, on the left, stormwater has been thought of as a waste product. It's something to quickly capture, get it off our roads, move it, transfer it somewhere else, and discharge it elsewhere. We use great infrastructure, pipes, tunnels, catch basins, gutters, to be able to capture this stormwater, move it, and discharge it. Well, there's been a evolution or revolution, however you'd like to call it, over the last few decades where we're moving and we're seeing less gray infrastructure and we're moving to green infrastructure, and which we call green stormwater infrastructure, GSI. And GSI mimics natural processes, it mimics natural systems to treat, filter, and infiltrate the water, the stormwater, at its source or as close to its source as possible. So can anyone tell me why we call it gray infrastructure? What's the color related to? Anyone? What is it?
Metal.
Yep. The color of your pipes, the color of your concrete, right? It's gray, it's boring. What about green?
Grass.
Grass. Plants. Yeah. It's more lively, right? It's alive. So that's the sort of color coding there. It's a fun way to look at it. I like this schematic, but I also really like the definition of GSI. And this was, the definition is pulled from the 2019 Water Infrastructure Improvement Act that Congress passed. And it defines GSI as the range of measures that use plant or soil systems, permeable pavement, or other permeable surfaces or substrates, stormwater harvest and reuse, or landscaping to store, infiltrate, or evapotranspirate stormwater and reduce flows to our sewer systems and or to surface waters. So it's a range of measures that we can use collectively to help treat and infiltrate our water. This schematic here is showing sort of a bit of a difference between our traditional gray infrastructure and green infrastructure. If you look at the left, the one thing that we definitely want to do when we look at designing stormwater control measures is we want to slow the water down. Again, impervious surfaces increases that speed of flow. We want to slow it down because that's what's causing erosion. So flow control is really important. We also want to spread it out. We want to detain it, again, to reduce our peak flows. And so on the left, you've got more of the mechanical components of stormwater design and management. And as you move to the right, we're getting more to the green aspects. Now, GSI still includes those mechanical components. So we still include flow control. We're still detaining water, retaining water. But with GSI, we're also now adding that soak component. So we're using filtration, we're using treatment, and we're using infiltration in our GSI. Great, so sort of as a recap, the principles of GSI are to mimic nature. So we're mimicking natural processes that we see all around us. We're percolating water through the ground where sediment and bacteria can get trapped. We're using plant root systems to help uptake nutrients. And we're moving water through the ground and through transpiration of our plants. We treat it as a resource. That's the biggest sort of overall lesson here, is that whereas gray infrastructure is treating it as a waste product, something to get rid of, we're looking at it as a resource. We want to infiltrate that water as much as possible to recharge our aquifers that we depend on for drinking water, to recharge our stream base flows. We can use GSI to capture water on site and store it. So sometimes using like a rainwater harvesting system where we can capture it off the roof, store it in a cistern, and then reuse that water later on during dry periods to help irrigate the landscape on our sites. And we'll get into some of the co-benefits, but the great thing about using GSI is there is a lot of other benefits besides just stormwater management. And the last point here is it promotes healthier spaces for people, plants, and animals. And I don't think anyone can argue with that. So if you're not already convinced that GSI is pretty awesome, I will just point out a couple more points here. We like to think of it as it's very flexible in design. So we can fit GSI practices in little tiny parklets or spaces, so we can fit them in to a parking island. We can fit them in between a roadway and a sidewalk. They can be very small, but they can also be really big too, depending on your site and what your site constraints are. You can also design them so that you can have multiple practices that work together throughout a system or throughout a site. So you can be very flexible with the design. Another one here is interactive. So in this picture, I really like this picture because you can see there's two children that are very up close and personal with the GSI here. I think this is a bioretention facility. And how many times have you ever seen an adult tell their kids, oh yeah, get really close to that drop inlet, feel free to look right into it, right? You don't ever hear that, especially if you've watched the movie It. So with GSI, you can really get up close and personal. You can have those interactive components. And we designed a bioretention facility for a Boston Public School a few years ago where we intentionally put stepping stones and a walking path meandering through the bioretention facility because we wanted to provide an opportunity for the school students, teachers, and community to really be able to engage and interact with the GSI and learn something. Another great thing about it is you can be creative and add art components to it. So you can see in this photo, there's some concrete components to this GSI. Sometimes if the site has grading constraints, we need to put in a retaining wall. Well, that provides the perfect space for a mural, to hire a local artist to come in and add an art element to it as well. Oh, and then the last one here is educational. We'll come back to this point. But wherever we design GSI in a popular place, so a park, a town hall, a boat ramp, somewhere where a lot of people are going to come into contact with it, we always like to, to really encourage our client to add some educational signage. People are curious. They want to be involved in the process. They want to understand what's happening here and how to keep their waters safe and healthy. So they want to learn about it, and why not? And they also not only want to learn about what the town is doing or the community is doing, but what they can do as well. Reducing their fertilizer, picking up pet waste, things like that. So this is just to show that there are many different terms used for GSI. So you might have heard not only green stormwater infrastructure, nature-based solutions, low impact development is another term used to define the same principle. And so in this case, Town of Mendon selected low impact development as the term to include in their bylaws. I just wanted to highlight that it's basically the same thing. In Mendon zoning bylaws, they define low impact development as practices that use or mimic natural processes. So again, talking about the same thing here. So let's get into those benefits. A couple slides ago, I mentioned there's a lot of great co-benefits of doing GSI. We've already talked a little bit about the water quality, so I'll move past that and talk about energy. Less pavement means less heat. So one of the principles of GSI is taking away as much impervious cover as possible, replacing it with things like landscaping or porous surfaces, our pervious pavement and pervious pavers. If you have, so hard surfaces, impervious cover tends to trap and store heat so that it feels a lot hotter than it actually is. By replacing some of that impervious cover with landscaped areas, we can really reduce that heat island effect. And if we're planting trees, not only do those trees provide shade for people and animals underneath them, but also if you plant them near a building, it also helps to shade the building. And so less heat trapped in and around the building obviously means less energy costs to cool that building during the summertime. And of course, more plants mean better air quality. Plants do help clean the air, so that's always a good thing as well. One of my favorite benefits to talk about is community and habitat. So again, GSI, we think green, we think plants. And if you plant them correctly, which we always try to encourage plantings of native plants and mixing in some pollinators, you're going to attract the bugs, the bees, the butterflies, the birds. You're going to really create a nice habitat for those critters to come to. And if you disperse GSI throughout the urban landscape, you're also creating a habitat corridor for those bugs and critters to go between. For community, when you insert more GSI and landscaped areas, it's more open space for folks to recreate. And when people see more green space, they're more encouraged to get outside and be active and connect with other people in the outdoors. And being outdoors is not only good for our mental health, but our physical health as well. And resilience. So GSI practices are resilient to a changing climate. So where you have gray infrastructure, you have fixed pipes, you have fixed catch basins, right? When you design a gray infrastructure system, you design it so the pipe starts at this invert elevation and it ends at this one, and that's fixed. Sometimes it's even fixed in concrete. With green infrastructure, it can adapt. These are intended to be able to be a little bit more flexible with a changing climate. And sometimes we design GSI to assist with a changing climate. So for example, we have a site in Harwich where we are helping to redesign a boat ramp parking lot. And the parking lot is a very low-lying gravel parking area that is just prone to inundation from the tide and some high tide flooding events. And so what we're going to add to the design for the parking spaces is these pervious pavers that are going to add some structure to the parking area. So when there are those high tidal events, when there is that flooding, it can be a little bit more stabilized. And practices along shorelines, such as wetlands and buffers, they can help protect areas from erosion, from storm impacts, and from flooding. Again, another example of this is we have a site in the town of Barnstable. Again, it's close to a beach area where there's a boat ramp, and as part of the design, we're actually going to be adding a vegetated buffer. So we're going to be planting taller grasses and shrubs, and that's going to provide a windbreak so that the sand on the beach is going to hopefully stay on the beach and not blow up into the parking lot, into our GSI practices, and hopefully prevent some early clogging there. So all of this to say is that there's a lot of GSI practices in our toolbox. We think of it as a toolbox. There's many tools, and they come in many different forms, shapes, and sizes. And depending on your site conditions, the existing constraints that you have, and your goals with the site, there's usually something in this toolbox for every site. And I've highlighted just a few of the more common ones here. I sort of tried to organize them into function area. So we've got convert, convey, filter, infiltrate, reuse, and protect. And I wish there was a fun acronym for that, but I wasn't super creative when I put this together. But for convert, so that's the first one, we convert, again, impervious surfaces to pervious surfaces. So using permeable, porous, and pervious pavements. With convey, sometimes we want to move stormwater from one location to another on site. Perhaps in this corner, we don't have a ton of room to grade a little depression where we can manage stormwater, but over here we do. So we're going to use a grass swale or channel to effectively move that stormwater from one location to another. And in that grass swale, we can still have a little bit of treatment. We can still have a little bit of infiltration as we go. Filtering practices, we use bioretention, rain gardens, sometimes even sand filters. All of these practices have a filter media that help to filter out pollutants as the water percolates through the media. Infiltration practices, where we are able to infiltrate water, we do, depending on the site conditions. And we use a range of practices for that. Sometimes it's recharge chambers, sometimes it's underground infiltration chambers. The Cultic ones, they look, they're plastic and yellow. I'm sure a lot of you have seen them. And sometimes we allow infiltration underneath a bioretention facility if we have the ability to do that. Constructed wetlands, I do want to point out, maybe it wasn't used here because we don't have an issue with high groundwater at this site, but a lot of the sites where we are located on the Cape, we're very close to a shoreline, whether that's close to the ocean or a pond or a lake. And so we are using that high groundwater to our advantage when we design a wet practice. And it operates and functions very much like an actual natural wetland system, where it's filtering and treating that water before it moves into its discharge location. Reuse, rainwater harvesting. This is something that can be done at a large scale, like at a school or a town hall, but also at the residential scale. So a lot of people I've been seeing this a lot more, a lot of people are putting rainwater barrels at their house to use for their gardens and their irrigation. And protect. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is included in the sort of suite of GSI is also conservation measures. So protecting underutilized land, protecting sensitive areas, making sure that areas in floodplains are not developed. And so really protecting that land and preserving its natural ability to manage the stormwater and sort of recharge and infiltrate. Before I turn over to Eliza to talk about Mendon, so this is sort of the range, the toolbox of tools that you can use. Obviously, as I mentioned, each site is different. You have site conditions that may encourage use of a particular practice or discourage use depending on those constraints. With this particular project with the town of Mendon, because this is a demonstration project, they wanted to use as many different types of GSI as possible. So we did our best when we were at the design table to kind of look at the site constraints, see what would work and what would not. And we ended up with a few different types of GSI, and Eliza's going to walk us through those and how they work.
All right, so I'm going to talk about what we did specifically at this site. If anybody has questions, please stop and ask them. We'll also talk about them outside, but if anything's unclear, do stop and ask me, because I've spent a lot of time with this, but it's not as familiar to maybe to all of you. So Dan spoke a little bit about this at the beginning. This is what the site looked like before we started design. We've got the town hall, the annex, the new police station, and then this was the old police station before it was demolished. We have cruiser parking back here that's kind of disconnected from the rest of the site. We actually have an entrance to the police station, the new police station that was blocked by the old police station. And the back of the site was, I think the word for it just was kind of disorganized. There was not formalized parking. You can see we have pavement, gravel. There was kind of a lot going on and it wasn't very organized. There was a lot of impervious area. So one of our main goals was to organize and formalize the site. So the way we did that was to lay out parking and come up with a little bit better traffic flow to the site. So this is the site as it is now. We reduced from 2 entrances and then entrance exits to the site. We have 1 two-way entrance and exit and 1 exit to the site, which was important for traffic flow. But because this is kind of a tough intersection, we decided it was exit only and it was right turn only. So that would hopefully reduce any traffic issues. As you can see, we've laid out parking more formally. We also had to work with the existing buildings, the existing grades, and also this existing underground detention system. So this is gray infrastructure. It's actually better gray infrastructure than some, but the way this system works is it's essentially just an underground tank that fills up during storms and then discharges. There's an outlet up here that we'll see when we walk around campus. And we incorporated that into our design, did not make any changes to it, but we connected into that system. So there's 2 categories of green infrastructure. We have biofiltration and impervious surfaces. So the first one I'm going to talk about is biofiltration. We've got one here, 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 and then the planter next to the town hall. So, as Gemma spoke a little bit about, these biofilters are basically a way to mimic natural processes and use those to treat and manage stormwater. They can do kind of triple duty. They can manage stormwater, they can provide habitat for pollinators or other small animals or insects, and they can look really nice for humans on the site. And they mainly function, they reduce the runoff by, as Gemma mentioned, they trap it, detain it, slow it down, and then infiltrate. We do have some constraints in infiltration here we can get into later, but that's kind of the basic practice. And they treat stormwater in 2 ways. There's physical filtration and then also chemical filtration from the microbes and the plants. So these are just some photos of biofiltration practices at various different sites. You can see they could be quite small. This is just in a little parking island, to larger and more vegetated practices. They come in lots of different versions and are appealing to butterflies and small children and everybody in between. So there's a couple different versions of what essentially is the same function, and depending on your site, you can pick and choose what works best at the site. So the simplest filtration is a rain garden, and this essentially is just a depression in the landscape that collects stormwater. It uses the soil and the plants to filter and infiltrate, but there's very little other infrastructure. So during a storm, this fills up. If there's more water than it can handle, it will overflow across the surface. And then after the storm, it infiltrates, soaks into the ground. So this is pretty straightforward. These can be done at very small scales, like individual homes. That's often something people like to do. Yeah, so that's the starting point of these filtration systems. So then here we've got 2 examples of bioretention areas. These are both functioning the same, but depending on what your site looks like, you may be able to do a more natural bioretention, which we have on the Mendon site. If you're in a more urban site or you don't have as much space, you may need to put what we call hard edge bioretention, which has curves or other walls. It just gives you a little more space without having to grade out a slope. Get more volume and less square footage. So the important things to note here are these both have a inflow point, a specified inflow point, whether it's from a parking lot like this one or from a sidewalk. You have a specific inflow point. The water goes into a sediment forebay area, which allows the sediment and other materials, leaves, trash, etc., to drop out. And that's really important because, as we'll talk about with maintenance, this allows for easier maintenance. You don't end up with things in your plants that you have to pick through. It's all just concentrated in one spot. So in theory, it's just a shovel, and you can just take things out easily at the one point. The other important thing to note here is these both have an overflow structure. So in the larger storms, instead of overflowing across a lawn or other areas like the rain garden, in the larger storms, these go into those overflow structures, which you'll see on this site. And these often connect back into a gray infrastructure system. On the Mendon site, they connect into that underground detection system. So in the larger storms, that is where extra runoff will go. And there's also, this is optional, and we have some of the bios on this site have it, and some of them don't, but we have an under drain pipe here, which can allow for additional water to get out of the system if you have bad soils underneath, or if for some other reason, like you have a drinking water well like we do here, you can't infiltrate under the system, you can put in a pipe to convey the water out of the system. So then, this is kind of unique to this site. This is something we don't often use, but this site was a great opportunity to use it. It's basically a hard edge bioretention, but in a smaller area, in a planter box. And it functions the same way. You have an inlet. In this case, and often for these planter boxes, it's downspout or something similar. And you've got similar plants. You have filtration soil, you have filtration stone. And the one big difference about this system is that it doesn't have a sediment forebay because the water's coming from a roof or another surface that isn't generating as much sediment or pollutants. Also, it's an overflow. You'll see this all outside. It's the same principles, just a slightly different configuration. So these are some pictures from construction. You'll be able to see a lot of this outside. Reload. There we go. You'll be able to see some of this, but a lot of it's been covered over. This is the stone at the bottom of the big bioretention area in the middle island. These are both the planter box, which actually you'll be able to see pretty well. This is the inlet, the inflow path to one of the bio areas. So these are just some kind of progress photos. So, as I mentioned, we have two main categories. That was biofiltration. There are 4 of those. And then we also have pervious surfaces, which are pervious pavement and pavers. And those we have here, 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 and this whole driveway, which this has not been constructed yet, but you may have noticed some of this pavement looks slightly different, and that's why. So why would you use this type of practice? The really great thing is you don't have to compromise anything on your site in terms of site function or use. You need to have a parking lot, you can still have a parking lot. You need to have sidewalks, you can still have sidewalks. But the benefit of it is that obviously it infiltrates water, so you can reduce the amount of runoff coming off the site. It can't take everything from every storm. In larger storms, there will still be runoff, so often we combine a pervious pavement with something like a bioretention area or other stormwater practices. And it can provide really great pollutant removal. It is very important that it's maintained well. Otherwise, over time, it will become less pervious and it will just end up, if unmaintained, it will just end up like regular pavement, or perhaps worse because then it becomes a sediment source. So maintenance is important for this one, as we'll talk about. There are a number of different types of materials that you can use. There's pavement and concrete that look very similar to typical pavement concrete. And then there are lots of paper systems, different proprietary materials. So you can kind of find one that fits the use and the aesthetics of your site. They all work in the same manner. They have a layer that allows water to infiltrate, and then various sand and stone layers underneath that filter. Again, you can put it in under drain. You don't have to. It depends on the site. So the function is pretty basic. It infiltrates, it fills up, and then it outlets. You do need an outlet somewhere in the site. And this slide is just some examples of various materials. Pavement, concrete, these are some pavers. This is another even lower visibility option to stabilize the soil. So if you have a very low impact or an area that doesn't get used that much, you can grow grass there, but it's still more stable than parking on. And these are some photos from this site. You'll see these when we go out there. We can take a closer look at the materials. So just to recap on what's on this site, we have a couple different practices, but they're all spread out. We have them from the front to the back of the site, and they're all fairly small areas because due to the site constraints, that's what we had to work with. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was kind of a sneaky third green infrastructure practice that often gets forgotten because it's not as cool looking and people may not even realize it unless you are the one designing the site. But removing pavement can be a really effective tool. As you can see, we had a big pavement reduction, or a big impervious reduction on the site simply because we reorganized, we formalized parking, we added green space. So it's not changing necessarily the pollutants that are coming off the impervious area, but if you can reduce that by 50%, that's already a 50% reduction in stormwater pollutants. So this can be a really good tool, and this is something that we would encourage you to encourage. And just seeing if you can add more green space to the site, get it more organized. You don't need a big parking lot if it's not being used, that kind of thing. So yeah, those are the practices we used on this site. Yeah, go ahead.
I just had a question. Was the decision not to make the entire site impervious, where there's pavement cost, like, was that the
pervious? So pervious pavement can, it wears, it's not wearing, but we often like to keep the drive aisles where there's more traffic impervious, because they will get clogged. If these drive aisles would get clogged sooner, so by just having the parking spaces pervious, it will last longer. I don't know if cost factored into that, but usually having the parking spaces themselves is a little easier to have those pervious than the entire site. Yeah.
What is the project cost for this, and then the time from like concept to actual implementation of all these different measures?
You almost got the cost information.
Yes.
And the timeline too. It's a quick timeline.
So the construction cost was about just under 800K. And then the planning level costs were just over $100,000 to design from planning, permitting, design phase, all of that to preparing the bid package and going out to bid. The town went through the MVP process in 2018. And in 2019, we wrote the action grant for the design phase. And then construction started in August of 2022.
How much of that was covered by an MVP grant?
Do you have this?
Yeah, the design was covered, and that was $170,000.
There was a town match for that though, right?
Yeah, you matched it with the demo of the
Right,
police.
right.
That's
but
right.
The actual,
Fine.
but what we actually received was $170,000, yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, the MVP grant does also, construction costs are also eligible for MVP funding. There is a 25% match requirement, which can be done with in-kind work from municipality, volunteers, community members, or the cost match. It can be matching federal funds, local funds, private funds, anything but state funds.
Go ahead.
How does that construction cost compare to a traditional non-GI approach?
Depends. In this case, it may have been more expensive. We were trying to do more of a demonstration project. We had some grant funding. It can be less expensive. Porous pavement, permeable pavement is the same as regular pavement, but you typically put a bigger subbase on it to store the water, so that adds cost. But if you eliminate something else, then it's kind of a wash. So it kind of depends really on the constraints. And it's a great segue. Let me talk about a couple things. Again, my name is Rich Clater, Principal Horsey Witten Group. I'm just going to have a couple of slides on can we do this sort of everywhere or at any particular site? And the answer is, well, yes, but it doesn't just happen. If you're going to do green infrastructure, it sort of falls into two camps, what I call new development, redevelopment, where you're regulating. You're going to put in a new project, and you have to meet the codes, or you're going to redevelop enough of a site that you then trigger requirements. And in Massachusetts, we have state regulations, we have federal regulations through the Municipal Stormwater Program, MS4, which is delegated to many communities, and then you have local regulations. And what these tend to do is drive the choices. And if your regulations say you're just going to meet a certain stormwater requirement, you're not necessarily going to get the green infrastructure. We talked a little bit about the hard work that Mendon did before this project and upgrading their regulations. The important thing is to have a mechanism to weigh it against the status quo. Sometimes it's hard to say you have to do these kind of practices because other kind of practices will meet the letter of the law. But you can certainly build incentives in, and you can say you must do this to the maximum extent practicable. You have to infiltrate a certain amount, and then you have things like checklists or incentives, so that when you're before a planning board or you're before a conservation commission, so I've done this, and here's why I chose these different practices. I didn't use green infrastructure here because I have a contaminated subsoil, or I have bedrock, or I have some other kind of physical constraint that I can't do it. But otherwise, you're sort of expected to do it. So, and again, it's not just the stormwater controls, it's also weaved into the site and zoning requirements. How many parking spaces do you need for particular uses? Is there an open space component or setbacks that have to be green? Do you have a tree canopy coverage? All of those things help drive you towards this stuff in new development. In existing development, much of the town drains to the Blackstone, much of the area drains to the Charles River. We have significant pollutant issues in these water bodies, phosphorus driving in Charles, phosphorus and other pollutants in the Blackstone, but many of these communities are going to have to do some retrofitting. Places like town halls, the public works yards, and even streets, even town-owned and controlled streets. So retrofit is a little bit different. You're going back into the existing landscape and fixing what was previously built. And that tends to be harder, but again, there's a whole approach here because Gemma went through the toolbox. We have lots of different tools. We have lots of different options. It's certainly doable. Cost and feasibility drive a lot of the decision making. And so when you go into a site, you evaluate what are your opportunities, what are your constraints, what can you do, what can't you do, and then ultimately how much it's going to cost. And in some cases, it's a balancing act. Some cases, there's a little bit of gray infrastructure. Some cases, there's a little bit of green infrastructure. I think the important thing is if you can line up those co-benefits, then you're not just meeting a stormwater requirement. Sort of the problem with just doing gray infrastructure and the minimum requirement for code compliance is you're only sort of checking one box. You don't check any of the urban heat island effect. You don't check the quality of life. You don't check air quality, those kind of things. So you'll see on the campus today, one of the big things we did is we removed a huge swath of impervious cover for the exit drive, which was right here to the right. Two-way traffic in and out. It was a big area. It had parking in there. And by taking that out and putting in green space and a parklet, we're going to make it a whole different environment. Next steps for the community?
Yes. Oh, already, okay. See,
Sorry, I just threw that on.
All right, let's see. So, I guess you can do the next slide.
Sure.
So, let's see, next steps. I mean, one good thing is to review projects that you have to do in town. And, you know, if you can use these practices in the long run, it'll probably save money. It might cost a little bit more upfront, but in the long run, it's going to make a better environment and you can save money. Understanding the cost benefits of GSI in your community, and there's a website there. I think we're going to share this with people, right? So you can get all the information. Network with various groups. Massachusetts has so many different grants and support from nonprofits, the state, and just keeping in touch with what's available. Network with various groups, same thing. Overcoming barriers to GSI, make changes in the bylaws and subdivision regulations, and share information in the town and regionally. Next slide. So for funding sources, obviously MVP is a great source. The Southeast New England program is also a good source. The Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, they also have grant opportunities. I don't think Hopkinton is in it, but all the other towns are in that group. But there are a lot of watershed associations and groups where they have different projects and funding. I wanted to note the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, which are the federal laws that passed. They have billions of dollars, and they have billions of dollars for climate change, extreme weather events, and resiliency. And that money will funnel down to the towns. And so just staying in touch with your representatives, federal and state, just to know where that money is coming from, and getting on mailing lists of different groups to find out what opportunities there might be. The next slide. And just working with local partners, your regional planning commission offers technical assistance money. The watershed associations, like I mentioned before, and other nonprofits like Mass Audubon, and you know, just keeping good connections within your town.
Yeah, and I think an important part of next steps for your community is to get and encourage people to be involved early on in the process, and that's, you know, educating your public. You'll find people coming out of the woodwork that are interested in this, and they'll want to volunteer, like Ann and others did as part of the town here. Specifically what Mendon did as part of their education campaign, if you will, is they're providing information about this project in a few different ways. They have a website, which I show sort of a screenshot of this here, but we'll make sure to send that out as part of our post-workshop follow-up. The website has a lot of great information for those folks who are more like paper copies of things, the town also has these brochures that we handed out today that provide a walking tour. So people can pick this up in town hall, go out the front door, and then make their way around the campus. And at each of the stops of the tour, there's going to be an educational sign that gives more information about what folks are looking at. Training and workshops, so things like this workshop here helps provide information and educate the public. We do all sorts of trainings from general public to town staff to state, federal stakeholders, and so just getting, again, people involved and understanding the topics. Volunteer planting days, this is one of my favorite ways to get folks involved. Once you've constructed the bioretention, the rain garden, the planter, whatever it is, you need to plant it. And there's no better way for people to understand these concepts than to get their hands dirty. And so oftentimes we'll have folks volunteering to help us plant a bioretention or a wet swale. And it's a great way to meet folks in the community as well. And then adopt a GSI program, so similar to adopting a street or a little landscape area in a roadway. Volunteer groups can adopt a GSI. They can help weed and prune and maintain and make sure that it's looking really well. So again, educate and involve your public is a good next step. And this is a great segue to just giving you a bit of a prime on maintaining GSI, but we are going to, after this, go out onto the site and take a look at what we've installed and talk more in details about the maintenance. So in order for these GSI practices to work effectively, to do what they were designed to do, they have to be maintained. This is a most critical component of our design and our project. And when we look at maintenance, we break it down into the different function levels of our GSI practices, because they all work differently, they all are designed differently, but for the most part, they all have the same sort of function areas. We look at collect, where's the water coming into, how are we capturing sediment and debris, how are we moving it, filtering it, where does it go in overflow times, and we also look at the surrounding area. What can we do to help minimize pollutants and debris and sediment coming from our surrounding area into our practice? So we're going to turn it over to Mike, who's going to go into a little bit more detail about this.
Hey everyone, and as Gemma said, it was outside to look at this more, so I'm going to try to keep it brief. Really, you'll start to hear a theme, and we'll go over it at the end here. But when you start at the beginning, collect. You look at the diversion structures, you look at your sumps, you look at the trench rates, curb cuts, and you check them to make sure they're clear. You look at them periodically. You should probably schedule 2 times a year that you look at the entire system, start to finish. And then after any major rain event, 2 inches or more, you should go look at some of these places. Because one of the major things is that sediment is the enemy. If you stop the sediment early, it doesn't get further down the system where it starts to clog up and become a much harder thing to remove. So making sure the water is flowing properly at the start is really what collecting boils down to. When you look at capturing, this is where we're capturing sediment. This is where we're separating out some of the initial pollutants. And good design in the beginning means less work later. So one of the major things here is that we've learned over years that a sediment forebay, a place for that sediment to settle out when the water slows, should be easy to maintain. And we'll go outside and we'll see this, but if you put in large river rock, you're going to have to scoop out around large river rock, and that can become a big pain. It might not look as nice to put in a pervious pavement panel like you see on the top right here, but it's much easier to scoop out the sediment after it gets to a certain depth. And again, twice a year and after every major rain event is kind of the rule of thumb. Once you've cleaned out some of the sediment, you can continue to move the water where you want it on site. And in maintenance here, you're looking at making sure that you look periodically to see that sediment hasn't made it past your capture system into these swales. If it has, remove it early and figure out why the sediment got passed. And the other thing to look at after major rain events is erosion. So if you're using any vegetated swales or non-hard systems, you want to make sure there's no areas that have eroded, especially in the initial years of plant growth and establishment. Then we get to the filter. This is what everyone looks at. It's the rain garden, it's the bioswale, it's the wet pond. This is the place where you're looking at vegetation maintenance. And again, twice a year. Spring, come in and do a weeding, and in the fall, go through and do a weeding. You're also looking for sediment and debris that's collected. And then after any major rain event, make sure that none of those things have washed in. The earlier you get on invasive plants, the less of a problem they are. And the quicker you can get your plants established, the less chance there is for invasives to make their way into the site. And I'll talk a little bit more about that outside and here at the end. But as the next step, hopefully you've collected most of the stuff that you need to worry about before it gets to this stage. And then finally, overflow. This is where you're looking at where the water is going if there's just too much. And so that's where you look at your overflow structures. This would be, again, you have a beehive grate, make sure that that's clear. Make sure that the sump is cleaned out once in a while. If it's a surface overflow, make sure there's no erosion. Make sure that it's properly working and nothing's blocking it up, again, debris from something else. And then we come down to it again, the surrounding area, remove debris. Sweep the pavements once in a while, don't let things build up. And ensure that the drainage network is working. So if you boil this down, it's have a plan, which is a maintenance schedule, 2 times a year with occasional reviews later on or after rain events. Sweep. You want to follow the water upstream and downstream, make sure that it's collecting properly, make sure it's not getting stuck anywhere, and make sure it's going the place it's supposed to go. And you want to make sure that you've collected that sediment, because sediment is the enemy. Weeding, if you do some weeding early on and you do it twice a year, you'll have a much easier time getting native plants to establish themselves. Typically in a good maintenance schedule, a visual guide to weed should be included for anyone doing the work. And there should also be a connection where if a person has a question, one of the guys out there, one of the women out there pulling a plant, like, is this a plant that's supposed to be here or not? Have a place that they can call and they can ask the question so that you don't end up pulling all of your native plantings on accident one day. Pruning in a very similar way. This usually works with woody herbaceous materials and trees. Remove the dead or broken wood. It'll be healthier for the plant. And control the overgrowth. If it's getting in the way, cut it. Plants can handle pruning pretty well. Usually, again, do it in the spring or the fall. Some plants are a little more specific, but when we design these, if it's a good design, we should have plants that are pretty hardy and can take some of the abuse that it might naturally occur, which you'd just be emulating with your pruning. Finally, fertilizing, and this is me on a soapbox for a second here. Don't fertilize with one caveat, which is when you're first installing your system, have your soil tested, see if there are any nutrient deficiencies, and fix those deficiencies. If you plant a lot of shrubs and herbaceous perennials, it might be okay at the initial planting to plant a low number fertilizer, like a 555 NPK, nothing more. Most bioretention and rain garden and other species that we use in these systems are actually designed for low nutrient soils. So if you put in really rich soil and you hit it with 20/20 fertilizer, you're actually making those plants weaker and making it easier for invasive species to really grow because they take advantage of those nutrients. Whereas in a nutrient-starved system, these plants do well and weeds don't do as well. And finally, Rich is going to finish this off.
Yeah, bring it home. One thing about green infrastructure that separates from gray infrastructure is it's on the surface, it's in your face, right? So you can generally see when it needs maintenance. So if you don't maintain it twice a year, it'll tell you. It may start clogging, it may start ponding water, weeds will take over or whatever. So one of the things that we stress in the design of these things is design with maintenance in mind and talk to the client about maintenance. And if all you do is mow, your parks department or whatever, you have mowers, you guys mow, you're not used to pulling weeds or doing that kind of stuff. You should design for that. So this is a sand filter system in Rhode Island that they mow. Sometimes they don't mow it very frequently, and sometimes they catch up with the mowing, but it's easy to maintain. It's really easy to maintain. So mowing really comes down to what have you planted in it, and the whole game plan here is to do what you have the capability to do. And so all of these pictures that we've shown you, some of them are a garden, a museum and garden that has gardeners and stuff, and so they'll plant anything in there and they can keep up with it. Most municipal entities don't have the facilities to do that. This is a housing project on Nantucket of all places. It's supposed to have a low maintenance buffer. They mow it. Okay, so is that a problem? No, it's just different. The design was one thing and the implementation another. It's not the end of the world. And then sometimes they don't mow it and you get weeds and whatnot coming back in. It's okay. Inspections, we've provided the town with a maintenance manual that shows the weeds, which shows the frequency and what you're supposed to look for when you're maintaining this, when to do it. We'll talk about this in a little bit more. And then importantly, a plan that shows these 5 elements, the inflow, the collect, whatever. They show it on a plan and then lists exactly what you're supposed to do. And so you know where to look, you know what you're supposed to be doing, and you know what the activity is. This is where the sediment is collected. This is where we should be removing it. So that's it for now. Any more questions? We have a few minutes. We certainly have plenty of time in the field to answer more questions, but go ahead.
Based on the pervious pavement, a lot of pushback that we get from developers is, it's cost prohibitive, and it doesn't really make sense because of the maintenance. The forests get clogged up with the sand during winter, that type of thing. Yes. As the technology advances, that's not so much an issue, and the cost is more parity with like traditional impervious. I guess what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. You can argue that the capital costs of porous pavement might be a little higher than traditional, but if you look at all of the costs, so if you can do both your paving and your stormwater in the same location, or a lot of your stormwater, and you don't have to do a bunch of underground chambers somewhere else, it can be very expensive. They're out of sight, out of mind too. They tend not to get maintained regularly, or a big detention pond somewhere else. You could line up your costs, and it gets to the point that we heard earlier, why didn't we put porous pavement on the whole site? We generally don't do it in high traffic areas because it clogs faster. So to keep it working, the maintenance is a lot faster, or a lot more frequent. So do it smartly. We'll show you today, we have essentially a pavers system for the fire department to access their cistern. It'll rarely get traveled on. And that should require almost no maintenance or sweeping. And then we've located a lot of our porous pavement in the parking stalls, not in the main travel. Turning movements tend to mush the pavement and then clog the pores. You do have to maintain them. You'd have to sweep them. So a contract to sweep them periodically, just like anything, that's removing the sediment or the sand. Generally, we're not putting these in places that are getting sanded. So you wouldn't necessarily put these on your roads, up and down your roads where you're going to be putting sand down in the winter. So it's smart. It's just be smart about it. And then look at the life cycle costs. Time for a break?
Any other questions? Yes, Ed?
So you're showing underground detention in the back of the site here. Are there any health concerns with that? Water, sustained water, is that a concern? Mosquitoes, that kind of thing?
Good question. So first of all, that was here. That was done as part of the police station, but your question's still valid. They draw down between storm events. So, and it has a drawdown period. So the idea is that you don't have standing water in the system for days after a storm event. So it would draw down periodically. But it does need to be inspected. And I've seen a lot of stormwater, but I've seen some underground systems that get clogged or partially clogged, and they have standing water all the time, and that's not a great thing. So, underground stormwater has to be done sometimes because we can't fit everything we need to do. But as soon as you do that, you remove the problem from the surface. You don't see it. So it's certainly something that you need to be aware of and need to inspect. I don't know that I would expect to see significant contamination problem, but standing water underground, probably not the greatest thing. You get mold and some other stuff growing. I don't think you're going to get mosquitoes in there because they're not going to get light. Okay, let's take a break. Do you want to introduce?
Yeah, so for those of you who are joining us for the campus tour, we'll start in just a few minutes. We did have the maintenance checklist available. I do have a couple more copies here. If you didn't get one, come see me. It is an active construction site, so while you don't need hard hats and steel-toe boots today, we do ask that you just take care where you step and just make sure you look where you're walking. Some sidewalks have been poured, others have not. So again, just take care. Try and stay off landscape areas because we have started to hydro seed some of those. Wear a rain jacket because it's our lucky day. We're talking about stormwater and it's drizzling outside. So when you're ready, please meet us downstairs. If you go out the main door, take a left. We'll be over around the side of the building, just close to this corner here. Let's meet in about take muffins and coffee with you, and we'll meet in about 5 minutes. I have one copy of the checklist.
And thanks for coordinating this.